So a little bit more into my clinical reasoning that I'm working through here online. And the last video was about kind of those first 15 minutes with a patient, the kinds of things I'm thinking about. And the second one I want to go into is what happens when somebody comes in with an MRI report. Many times I'm not the first person somebody has seen about their problem. A lot of times, I might be the second, third, fourth, provider they've talked to about this, and it's not uncommon for them to have an MRI report with them. And one of the first questions I want, and that is a very important question a lot of people ask when they first come into me. We might be doing some talking, they might say something along the lines of, "Hey, do you want to see my MRI report?" And I always say, absolutely, I want to see it, because it seems like these days there's either people that think that an MRI explains everything for the patient, or that it explains absolutely nothing, it's not important. And I don't really agree with either. I'm using the MRI report as a piece of data, information, useful information, but it's only going to be one piece of a much larger picture that I'm trying to develop in that first encounter with a patient. So the first thing to think about is, what am I looking for when I get an MRI report from somebody? And I've been doing this for 20 years now almost, and what I've realized is people don't come to me with an MRI report. They come to me with an interpretation in their head of the MRI report. And that is a big difference that you need to remember as a clinician. It's, the report is just words, right? But somewhere between when they had the MRI done, when they showed up to see me, someone has explained those words to them. And it might have been another clinician. They might have stuffed it into Google or Chat GPT these days. They might have talked to a friend about it, gone to social media, and by the time that they're sitting down with me, they're often carrying a story with the MRI report that's much heavier than anything that's on the report. So my first question, after I start looking through it, is just trying to understand something before I immediately go into explaining the report. I'm trying to decide, what does this MRI report mean to you? And I like asking that question because they're going to give me an answer that's going to give me a lot of information about how we're going to move forward and what kind of conversation I have to have next to maybe contextualize any narrative that they might have developed about the MRI report. So when I'm looking through the MRI report, I'm not looking for a reason to tell somebody that they can't do something. I'm looking for context and clues. And the MRI is going to tell me, it's going to help me narrow where we're going to begin. That's the best way I look at it. The MRI might tell me where I don't want to start with someone, because through clinical reasoning experience from the past, and people that had similar things, there might be some things I check off my list. Sometimes it's going to give me an idea of what we need to more closely monitor as we get started, and it might even confirm something that I already was thinking before they gave it to me. But it's not going to change the plan that much. And it's just going to be another part of my clinical reasoning. It might change where we start. It might change how we might have to modify some things. But the long run, where I have a vision of going, it's not going to alter that a whole lot. And I'm not ignoring the MRI. I'm not worshiping the MRI results. I'm just integrating them into my thinking. So the way to understand why this matters is, I might have two different patients that have similar things on MRI. Let's say a disc bulge, tendon tear, or some arthritis somewhere, okay? And if one of the people, let's say the first person walks in and their story is, I have this report with this bulge and this arthritis and my life is over, they're catastrophized the situation. But then patient two is telling me, their doctor read me the report and they said, we got some things in here that we need to work around. We've got similar MRIs, but we have the patients are coming with different ideas of what can be done based on the story that they're carrying with them from the report. And it has nothing to do with the tissues being different. It just has to do with the story that they're carrying is different. So one of the biggest parts of my job in that instance, after they hand me the report, is not to get into explaining anatomy. it's helping the person keep the anatomy on the MRI report into some sort of perspective. So if before they see me, they've been spending months believing that this MRI finding explains every ache, pain, setback, and limitation in their life, then we're going to have a conversation about that. And that might take time to sort through. And it has nothing to do with the MRI being wrong, because MRI is just information. But what has happened after the report has been read to them is that there's been more power given to the report than it deserves. And that's where I start to say things like one of my new favorite phrases, let's not give too much power to this right now. And a lot of times people haven't been given that sort of permission around what they've seen on the report. And you have to notice that I'm not saying that the MRI doesn't matter. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying, how about we decide together how much this MRI should matter as we start to build a plan? And this means that rehabilitation is going to start earlier than you think with a patient. A lot of times people think it starts with the first time you put your hands on them or the first exercise you give them. But many times the rehabilitation is starting with that initial conversation. And once they start to maybe see the MRI report they've given you slightly differently, and not that we're dismissing it, but we're trying not to fear it. And we're trying to put everything that they've been told before into the proper context. And when we get that to happen, a lot of times we can get people moving differently, thinking differently, and they become a little bit more willing to try things that they had written off. And then we can start to layer in different exercises and start building confidence and start showing them that there's still a lot left that they can do. And before people leave my office after that initial visit, my goal isn't to get them thinking that my MRI doesn't matter. That's not what I'm after. I want them to start thinking that this MRI is just one piece of information on how we're going to build our plan to move forward. And the MRI is not going to decide what their future might look like. And that's my goal, is to get them to that point. And that gives us a different mindset to get started in our rehabilitation process. The MRI is going to help me do some thinking. That's what I want you to take from this. And if you're a clinician or anyone else in these spaces, that's how you have to look at an MRI. It's something that's going to help you think. It doesn't do my thinking for me, though. And this is true in any test that we order. It just gives us some data to help us start thinking. And a good clinician is not ignoring any piece of information. They're just deciding how much weight each piece of information they get deserves as they're building their clinical reasoning to help the patient. So the MRI is just telling me what that somebody sees. That's all it's saying. The patient is going to tell me what the MRI report means to them. And my job in those initial conversations is to help them bring those two stories together and into perspective so we can get to work.